The gavel fell like a guillotine, severing the Hawthorne family from their dignity. In the opulent Manhattan courtroom, Ava Monroe. The mistress smirked, her crocodile tears already drying. She had won. The DNA test was conclusive. Her son was a Hawthorne, and $1 billion fortune was now hers to claim. The billionaire's widow, matriarch, stood frozen. A pillar of Chanel-clad ice, her children shattered beside her. But what none of them knew was that the dead man had one last move to play. In a dusty law office, a single letter sealed with wax and bound by one instruction to be opened only after the verdict was waiting. And inside that letter was a truth far more scandalous and a secret heir far more shocking than anyone could ever imagine. Conrad Hawthorne, a man whose name was synonymous with five-star luxury and cutthroat business acumen, had not died quietly. He had slipped away, not in one of his own penthouse suites overlooking Central Park, but in a sterile white hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor, the final monotonous applause to a life lived at a roar. His death at 72 created a power vacuum that was felt from the boardrooms of New York to the exclusive ski slopes of Aspen. He left behind a global empire, Hawthorne Hotels, a wife of 45 years. Matriarch, 2 grown children, Adrian and Catherine, and a scandal that was about to erupt with the force of a dormant volcano. Matriarch Hawthorne was the archetypal society matriarch, a woman carved from New England granite and polished by decades of navigating the treacherous currents of the city's elite. Her silver hair was always impeccably styled, her posture ramrod straight, her grief a private, well-guarded fortress. She had stood by Conrad through hostile takeovers, market crashes, and his own insatiable ambition. She had co-built the empire her quiet elegance, the perfect foil to his brash genius. She had known about his indiscretions, of course. In their world, they were a regrettable, almost expected cost of doing business. But this last affair was different. This was Ava Monroe. Ava was not a fleeting dalliance. She was a former concierge from the flagship Hawthorne Plaza, 30 years Conrad's junior, with eyes the color of ambition and a backstory that changed with her audience. She was clever. She hadn't just been a mistress, she had been a student. She learned Conrad's habits, his weaknesses, his vanities. And 4 years ago, she had presented him with what he, a man who had everything secretly craved, most a second chance at fatherhood. She had given birth to a boy, Leo. Now with Conrad gone, Ava Monroe was making her claim. She wasn't asking for a quiet settlement or a discreet trust fund. She was demanding a seat at the table. She was claiming that her son, Leo Monroe, was Conrad Hawthorne's biological son, and therefore a primary heir to the Hawthorne fortune. The first salvo was fired not in a lawyer's office, but on the glossy pages of Vanity Fair. An exclusive interview, complete with soft focus photos of Ava and a cherubic blonde-haired Leo in a sun-drenched California garden. The headline was a masterpiece of passive aggression, the last love of a titan. Ava Monroe on life loss and a billionaire's secret son. Inside the Hawthorne family's Upper East Side mansion, a limestone behemoth that was less a home and more a museum of their own. Success, the article landed like a grenade. She's calling him his last love. Catherine Hawthorne seethed, throwing the magazine onto a mahogany table with such force that a priceless Ming vase rattled. At 35, Catherine was the artist of the family, her emotions as vivid and untamed as the abstract canvases she painted in her Tribeca loft, as if Mother was some sort of corporate merger. Adrian, the elder son and heir apparent, stood by the window. His jaw clenched so tightly, it was a wonder his teeth didn't crack. He was the quintessential firstborn of a dynasty Wharton education, Savile Row suits, and a demeanor that perpetually hovered between burdened and bored. It's a shakedown, pure and simple, a pathetic gold-digging fantasy. Matriarch, however, was silent. She picked up the magazine, her eyes scanning the professionally curated images of Ava's grief. She saw the designer dress, the subtle makeup, the way Leo was positioned to look directly into the camera, his innocent blue eyes, a weapon of mass emotional destruction. "She's not a fool, Adrian," Matriarch said, her voice dangerously calm. "Fools don't get a 10-page spread in Vanity Fair. They get a restraining order." She looked at her children, her gaze hardening. This isn't a squabble. This is war. And she has chosen the battlefield. The family's longtime lawyer, Samuel Pritchard, a man whose jowls sagged with the weight of 1,000 Hawthorne family secrets, confirmed Matriarch's fears a week later. They were gathered in the mansion's library, a room panelled in dark wood and smelling of old leather and regret. Her legal team is from Kirkland and Ellis. Pritchard announced, adjusting his spectacles. They're not ambulance chasers. They've filed a petition to the surrogate's court to establish paternity. They claim to have evidence. What evidence? Adrian snapped. A few holiday photos from St. Bart's. A gaudy diamond bracelet. Pritchard cleared his throat, a sound that always preceded bad news. They claim to have a DNA sample, Adrian. They're alleging Conrad agreed to a paternity test shortly before his last hospitalization. The room fell silent. Catherine sank into a leather armchair, her face pale. Adrian stared at Pritchard, disbelief warring with fury. Matriarch alone remained impassive, her hands folded in her lap. Conrad would never have agreed to that. Matriarch stated, her voice unwavering. He was careless, but he was not a complete idiot. He knew what it would mean. They have a story for that. Of course, Pritchard sighed, that he wanted to do right by the boy, that he was planning to amend his will. It's all hearsay, but it's compelling hearsay. Ava will cry on the stand. She'll paint a picture of a dying man desperate to legitimize his son, and a jury will eat it up with a silver spoon. So we fight. Adrian declared, his voice ringing with the authority he was so desperate to inherit. We hire the best. We drag her name through the mud until not even the tabloids will touch her. We will be strategic. Matriarch corrected him, her gaze cutting to her son. This is not a boardroom takeover. Your father's legacy is on trial. Our family is on trial. We will not win by being the loudest. We will win by being the smartest. But as the days turned into weeks, the Hawthorne family's confidence began to fray. Ava's legal team was relentless. They produced emails sentimental and flowery, allegedly from Conrad to Ava, speaking of our little man and a new beginning. They produced receipts for extravagant gifts, tuition for an exclusive preschool, a trust fund set up in Leo's name, small by Hawthorne standards, but symbolically significant. The Hawthorne's legal team fought back, painting Ava as a manipulative opportunist. They brought forth witnesses, former staff, disgruntled friends who spoke of her calculating nature. But it was all circumstantial. It was her word against a dead man's reputation. The real blow came when the judge, a no-nonsense woman named Judge Maria Rodriguez, granted Ava's motion to compel the estate to provide a DNA sample from Conrad's stored medical records for a court-supervised comparison. "They already have a sample," Adrian raged to Matriarch one night. "Pritchard's source says they got it from a drinking glass when he visited her. It's a complete violation of his privacy." "And yet here we are," Matriarch replied, looking out at the glittering lights of the city that she and Conrad had conquered together. His greatest strengths were his charm and his audacity. It seems they were also his greatest weaknesses. The night before the results were to be read in court, the mansion was suffocatingly quiet. The family ate dinner in near silence, the clinking of silverware on china the only sound. Adrian was drinking too much, his face flushed. Catherine was pushing food around her plate, her eyes red-rimmed. Matriarch, as always, was the center of the storm, perfectly still. After the plates were cleared, she looked at her children. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said, her voice clear and strong, "we are Hawthorns." That name meant something long before the money, and it will mean something long after. We will not be broken by this woman. We will endure. But as she lay in her vast, empty bed, that night, surrounded by the ghosts of a 45-year marriage, Matriarch Hawthorne allowed a single silent tear to trace a path down her cheek. She was prepared for the fight, but in her heart, she was also preparing for the fall. She feared that Ava Monroe, the concierge, with the ambitious eyes, had somehow outplayed them all, and she was about to find out just how right she was. The Surrogates Court of the County of New York is not a place designed for comfort. It's a stage for the rawest of human dramas. Grief, greed, and betrayal played out under the flat, unforgiving light of institutional chandeliers. For the Hawthorne family, it became their personal hell. The trial was a media circus. Reporters lined the steps of the courthouse, their cameras clicking like a swarm of metallic insects every time a member of the family arrived. Matriarch, always in muted shades of navy or charcoal grey, her pearls a subtle armor, would walk through the gauntlet without flinching, her face a mask of aristocratic indifference. Adrian, by her side, looked perpetually on the verge of throwing a punch. Catherine, her artistic sensibilities assaulted by the vulgarity of it all, often looked as if she was about to be physically ill. In stark contrast, Ava Monroe played her part to perfection. She arrived each day in demure, tasteful outfits, her hand clutching a simple locket containing a picture of Conrad. She whispered to a sympathetic journalist. Her son Leo was thankfully absent, shielded from the proceedings, a fact her lawyers mentioned frequently to paint her as a protective mother. On the witness stand, she was a revelation of sorrow and sincerity. "Did you love Conrad Hawthorne?" her lawyer, a sharp, impeccably dressed man named Marcus Thorne, asked gently. Ava's eyes filled with tears. She dabbed at them with a handkerchief. "Conrad was my everything," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He wasn't just a powerful man. He was kind. He was funny. He saw me. The real me." She recounted stories of late-night talks of Conrad, confiding his fears of being remembered only for his buildings, of his deep desire to have a child who wasn't born into the crushing weight of the Hawthorne legacy. He wanted Leo to have a normal life, she wept. As normal as possible. The Hawthornes' lawyer Samuel Pritchard did his best on cross-examination. He was a bulldog, not a showman, and his attempts to poke holes in her story often made him look like a bully. "Ms. Monroe, isn't it true that you were deeply in debt before you began your relationship with Mr. Hawthorne?" "I was a young woman trying to make my way in New York City," she replied, her chin held high. That's not a crime. Isn't it true that you encouraged Mr. Hawthorne to buy you a condominium in the very building where his own son Adrian resided? Conrad wanted me to be safe. He wanted me to be close. He was a generous man. For every accusation Pritchard threw, Ava had a plausible, heartfelt answer. She had an explanation for everything from the timing of her pregnancy to the secret DNA test. Conrad knew his family would never approve. She explained, her gaze drifting towards Matriarch. He was afraid of the judgment. He told me, Ava, if anything happens to me, I need proof. Proof that Leo is mine, so they can't throw you and him out into the cold. It was an act of love, an act of protection. The Hawthornes could only watch as their father was posthumously rewritten into a sentimental old fool. Adrian's testimony was a disaster. His barely concealed rage came across as arrogance. He referred to Ava as the plaintiff, or that woman, and his denials of his father's emotional depth made him seem cold and detached. Catherine's turn on the stand was even more painful. She was honest, and her honesty was brutal. My father loved my mother, she said, her voice trembling. He was flawed, and he hurt her deeply. But this narrative, this story that Ms. Munro is spinning, it's a fantasy. It's an insult to 45 years of a life they built together. But to the jury, she sounded like a daughter in denial, desperately clinging to a picture of a perfect family that had long been shattered. The climax of the trial was the presentation of the DNA evidence. 2 labs, the one commissioned by Ava's team, and the court-ordered one using Conrad's hospital-stored sample, had come to the same conclusion. Dr. Annabel Reed, a forensic biologist with an impeccable resume, delivered the news in a calm, clinical monotone. The analysis compared the DNA profile of the child Leo Munro with the DNA profile of the deceased Conrad Hawthorne. The results are conclusive. The probability of paternity is 99.999%. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Adrian Hawthorne shot to his feet, his face ashen. That's not possible. Mr. Hawthorne, sit down. The judge commanded, her voice sharp as glass. Matriarch reached out and placed a hand on her son's arm, her touch firm, pulling him back into his seat. She did not look at Ava. She did not look at the jury. She stared straight ahead. Her regal composure, the only thing in the room that didn't seem to be crumbling. Ava Munro, for her part, bowed her head and began to sob. Not the theatrical tears of her earlier testimony, but deep, shoulder-shaking sobs of what appeared to be profound vindication and relief. Her lawyer put a comforting arm around her. It was a perfect tableau. The wronged woman finally given justice. The closing arguments were a formality. Marcus Thorne painted a picture of a modern love story of a powerful family trying to disinherit an innocent child. Samuel Pritchard argued a case of sophisticated fraud, but without concrete proof, his words sounded like the desperate sputtering of the vanquished. It took the jury less than a day. When they filed back in, their faces were grim, but resolute. The foreman, a middle-aged man in a cheap suit, stood and cleared his throat. On the matter of the petition to establish the paternity of Leo Munro, he began, his voice echoing in the silent room. We, the jury, find in favor of the petitioner, Ava Munro. The sound that escaped Catherine was a choked cry. Adrian looked as if he'd been struck by lightning. For the first time, Matriarch's mask slipped. Her eyes closed for a fraction of a second, a flicker of immense pain and weariness, before opening again, as defiant as ever. Across the aisle, Ava Munro, was hugging Marcus Thorne, her face buried in his shoulder. Then she looked up, her gaze sweeping past the defeated faces of the Hawthorne children and landing for one triumphant moment on Matriarch. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory. The concierge had toppled the Queen. The gavel fell. "This court is adjourned." The aftermath was chaos. Ava, flanked by her lawyers, walked out of the courthouse into a sea of flashing cameras and shouted questions. She was poised and gracious in her victory. This was never about money. She said, her voice thick with emotion. It was about a father's love and a son's birthright. Today, the court has honored Conrad's final wish. My son is a Hawthorne. The Hawthorne family slipped out a side entrance, hounded into a waiting black Escalade. The ride back to the mansion was a journey through a landscape of shock and grief. Adrian stared out the window, his reflection a pale, ghostly mask. Catherine was openly weeping. Matriarch said nothing until the car had passed through the heavy wrought iron gates of their estate. The silence inside the grand entrance hall felt heavier than ever before. "It's over," Adrian said, his voice hollow. "She won. She gets a piece of everything. The hotels, the stock, the homes. A third of his personal fortune going to her bastard child." The word bastard hung in the air, ugly and impotent. "Language, Adrian," Matriarch said softly, her composure returning as if summoned by the familiar walls of her home. "Language," he scoffed, his voice rising with hysteria. "Mother, we were just humiliated in front of the entire world. Our name, our legacy has been handed over to a glorified prostitute." "That is enough." Matriarch's voice cut through his anger, sharp and cold. Just then the butler, a man named Thomas, who had been with the family for 30 years, approached them, his expression funereal. "Mrs. Hawthorne," he said, his voice low. "A call for you. It's Mr. Benjamin Carter." Benjamin Carter. The name hung in the air. He wasn't just a lawyer. He was Conrad's oldest and dearest friend, a classmate from Yale, the executor of his will. He had remained conspicuously silent throughout the entire trial. Matriarch took the call in the library. The door firmly closed. Adrian and Catherine waited in the hall, their own grief momentarily forgotten, replaced by a nervous curiosity. What could Conrad's best friend possibly have to say? Now. After 10 minutes, the library door opened. Matriarch stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable. It was not the face of a defeated woman. It was something else entirely. There was a strange, almost electric calm about her. "Benjamin is coming over," she announced. "He says Conrad left something with him. A personal letter." Catherine frowned. "A letter? Why wouldn't he give it to us before?" Matriarch's lips curved into a faint, enigmatic smile. "Because my dear Conrad left very specific instructions. The letter was only to be unsealed and read in the presence of all relevant parties, including Miss Ava Monroe, after a final legal verdict on his paternity had been rendered." Adrian stared at her, a slow, dawning realization in his eyes. He knew this would happen. He anticipated it. "Your father," Matriarch said, walking past them into the grand salon, "was many things. A sentimental fool was not one of them. He may have lost the battle, but I have a distinct feeling Conrad Hawthorne was determined to win the war." An hour later, the library, which had been the Hawthorne family's war room, was transformed into a tense, silent theater. The air was thick with a strange mixture of defeat anticipation and the cloying scent of Ava Monroe's expensive perfume. She had been summoned by Benjamin Carter, an official and non-negotiable request from the executor of Conrad Hawthorne's estate. Ava arrived looking every bit the victor. She wore a cream-colored dress, a stark contrast to the somber tones of the Hawthornes. She was accompanied by her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, who looked both smug and slightly wary, as if sensing a trap he couldn't yet see. They sat on one side of the large mahogany desk, a portrait of Conrad Young, confident and ruthless, staring down at them from the wall above. On the other side sat Matriarch, flanked by a subdued Adrian and a nervous Catherine. Matriarch's composure was unnerving. She wasn't just calm. She seemed energized, a silent hum of power emanating from her. Benjamin Carter stood at the head of the desk. He was a small, bird-like man in his 70s, with kind eyes that belied a razor-sharp mind. In his hands he held a thick, cream-colored envelope, sealed with a glob of dark red wax, bearing the Hawthorne family crest. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice." Benjamin began, his voice dry as autumn leaves. "As the executor of Conrad's will, I am now obligated to fulfill one of his final directives. He left this letter in my keeping over a year ago, with very precise instructions." He paused, his gaze sweeping over everyone in the room. It was to remain sealed until any and all legal proceedings concerning his paternity of the child Leo Monroe were irrevocably concluded. That condition has now been met. Marcus Thorne shifted in his seat. "Mr. Carter, with all due respect, the court has rendered its verdict. My client's son has been legally recognized as a Hawthorne heir. Whatever is in that letter is emotionally poignant, perhaps, but legally moot." Perhaps Benjamin said, a flicker of something unreadable in his eyes. But Conrad was insistent. He wanted this read. He wanted clarity. He carefully slit the envelope with a silver letter opener. The sound was unnaturally loud in the silent room. He withdrew a sheaf of heavy paper filled with Conrad Hawthorne's familiar, aggressive handwriting. Benjamin cleared his throat. "To my family, and to Miss Monroe." He began to read. "If you are hearing these words, it means two things. First, that I am gone. I trust my exit was not too messy. Second, it means that a court of law has just made a ruling on a matter of my fatherhood. I can imagine the scene. Ava, you are no doubt looking beatific in your victory. Matriarch, my love, you are radiating an icy fury that could freeze hell over. Adrian, you are about to have an aneurysm. And Catherine, my sweet girl, your heart is broken. I am sorry for that. For all of it." Conrad's voice, channeled through his old friend, filled the room a ghost at the table. It was uncanny. Ava shifted, a flicker of unease crossing her face. "Let's start with you, Ava." Benjamin continued reading. "I'm sure your performance in court was magnificent. You were always a fine actress. You learned so much during your time with me, how to dress, what wine to order, how to feign interest in quarterly reports. You also learned that I, like many men of my age and station, possessed a cavernous ego. And you played it like a Stradivarius." Ava's face tightened. "This is insulting," she hissed. "It is his letter, Miss Monroe," Benjamin said coolly, and continued. "You came to me with a story, a beautiful story about love and a child, a legacy. It was almost perfect. There was just one problem. I knew you were lying." The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Ava's face went from smug to confused, to pale with dawning horror. "You see, you thought you were manipulating a vain old man, and you were. But a vain old man is still a dangerous man. You told me you were pregnant, and I was, I admit, momentarily thrilled. But then I remembered something from my own past. A childhood illness, mumps, a particularly nasty case when I was 12 years old. It laid me up for a month with a fever that nearly killed me. Benjamin Carter paused and looked up from the letter. He reached into his briefcase and pulled out another file, placing it on the desk. Conrad instructed me to retrieve his full medical history from his private physicians at Johns Hopkins. Benjamin explained. This is a report from Dr. Michael Weiss, his urologist for the past 30 years. He opened the file. I will spare you the technical jargon, he said, his eyes locking onto Ava Monroe. The report confirms what Conrad's childhood doctors had suspected. The mumps or chitis he suffered as a boy left him with a condition: azoospermia. In layman's terms, Conrad Hawthorne was completely and irreversibly sterile. He has been since he was a teenager. He was physically incapable of fathering a child. The silence that followed was absolute, a crushing void. Adrian and Catherine stared, their mouths agape. Matriarch's eyes were fixed on Ava, a cold, terrible light in them. Ava Monroe looked as if she had been turned to stone. No, she whispered. No, the DNA. Benjamin Carter picked up Conrad's letter again. The DNA. Yes, let's talk about the DNA, he read. A master stroke, Ava. Getting my DNA from a drinking glass. So clever. So cinematic. But you made a critical error. You assumed the only Hawthorne DNA in that house was mine. You forgot about my son. My real son. Adrian looked up, his face a mask of confusion. Me. No, not you, Adrian. The letter clarified a touch of paternal fondness in the words. I'm afraid I have to apologize to you. The glass you so cleverly stole from my study during a visit. The one I drank from. You didn't notice Adrian stopping by to see me just before you arrived. He was thirsty. He used the same glass. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Leo Monroe was not Conrad Hawthorne's son. He was his grandson. He was Adrian's son. Adrian's face went white, then a deep, mottled red. He looked at Ava, a memory of a drunken, regrettable one-night stand at a charity gala 5 years ago, an event Ava had been working, surfacing in his eyes with the force of a tidal wave. You have my eyes, Adrian, the letter continued, and Leo from the photos I've seen has them too. It was a long shot, a gamble on my part. But I knew you were reckless, and I knew she was opportunistic. A perfect storm of bad decisions. I let your charade play out, Ava, for one reason. I wanted your greed to be undeniable. I wanted you to have your day in court, to build your castle of lies so high that the fall would be all the more spectacular. You have perjured yourself in a court of law. You have committed fraud on a massive scale. I trust my lawyers and my formidable wife will know what to do with that information. Ava Monroe made a small, choking sound. Her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, looked at her with pure disgust, already backing his chair away as if she were contagious. But Conrad wasn't finished. Now. Benjamin read, his voice softening to the most important part of this letter. The real reason for this theatrical display. I have lied to you all. My sterility was not my only secret. It was merely the key to unlocking a much larger one. He turned a page. Before Matriarch, before the Empire, before the man you all knew, I was a different person. I was a 20-year-old boy in love. Her name was Isabelle Dubois. She was a painter, a French immigrant with a spirit as bright and fierce as a flame. My father, a man who valued bloodlines and bank accounts above all else, forbade our relationship. He threatened to disown me, to destroy her. I was a coward. I walked away. Tears welled in Catherine's eyes. Matriarch sat perfectly still, listening to the ghost of her husband confess the great sin of his youth. What my father never knew, what I myself only discovered a few years ago through a private investigator's tireless work, was that when I left, Isabel was pregnant. She gave birth to a son. She raised him alone in poverty, never asking me for a thing. She died of cancer when our boy was only 19. She named him Ethan. Benjamin Carter's voice grew thick with emotion as he read the final part of the letter. I have spent the last 2 years of my life trying to right the greatest wrong I ever committed. I found him, our son, Ethan. He is a good man, a carpenter living a quiet life in Oregon with a family of his own. He knew nothing of me. I have met him, I have told him the truth, and I have made my peace. Therefore, as my final act on this earth, I am rectifying the record. My will, the one you all have a copy of, is legitimate. It leaves the company Hawthorne Hotels in the capable hands of Matriarch and Adrian. It provides for Catherine's artistic endeavors. But my personal fortune, the liquid assets, the stocks, the properties held in my name, alone, the very fortune Ms. Monroe was trying to steal, is to be placed in a trust. The sole beneficiary of the Hawthorne family trust is not Leo Monroe. It is my firstborn, my true heir. Benjamin Carter looked up, his gaze sweeping over the wreckage in the room. He uttered the final devastating words from the letter. My son Ethan Dubois. The silence that followed the final word of the letter was not empty. It was a vacuum sucking the air from the room, filled with the deafening sound of multiple worlds shattering. For a long, suspended moment, no one moved. They were figures in a ghastly tableau of shock, each trapped in their own private sphere of disbelief. Ava Monroe was the first to break, and she broke completely. The carefully constructed facade of the grieving lover, the vindicated mother, crumbled into dust. The color drained from her face, leaving a pasty gray mask of pure horror. Her eyes, wet and unblinking, were locked on Adrian. It wasn't just the loss of the fortune that paralyzed her. It was the stunning, idiotic simplicity of her mistake. She had aimed a cannon at a king, only to realize she had loaded it with a picture of his son, and in firing it had blown her own fortress to smithereens. The realization that in her grasping ambition, she had not only targeted the wrong man, but had inadvertently exposed her own separate, deeply personal deception, was a cataclysm from which there was no recovery. She opened her mouth, a dry, ragged gasp escaping. A name. Adrian, she whispered, the sound pathetic and foreign in the opulent library. She tried again, lurching forward in her seat, her hands outstretched in a desperate, meaningless appeal. Adrian, I swear I didn't know for sure. I only suspected. I thought. The words tumbled out, a chaotic mess of half-truths and panicked lies dissolving into incoherence. Her lawyer, Marcus Thorne, a man whose career was built on calculated composure, rose to his feet with the abruptness of a man escaping a fire. His face was a mask of professional fury. He had been made a fool of his firm's reputation, hitched to a fraud so audacious it bordered on the surreal. My client, he began. His voice, clipped and freezing, was clearly misinformed. He practically spat the word. We were acting on information we believed to be true, presented to us under the guise of maternal certainty. Clearly, new and frankly astounding facts have come to light." He gave Ava a look of such withering contempt it was a violence all its own, a silent severing of their professional bond. He gathered his pristine leather briefcase, a symbol of a world she could no longer access, and walked out of the library without a backward glance, leaving her to face the executioners alone. His departure snapped the spell. Ava, now utterly abandoned, scrambled to her feet, her expensive dress looking cheap and garish in the solemn light. "Adrian, please," she cried, her voice rising to a shrill, desperate whine. "He's your son. I was going to tell you someday." Adrian rose slowly, deliberately from his chair. He seemed to have aged a decade in the last 10 minutes. The hot, impotent rage that had consumed him for months was gone, scoured out of him, leaving behind a chilling, hollow emptiness. He looked down at her, at this woman who had orchestrated his family's public humiliation, and felt a terrifying calm. "You used my father's memory to sell a lie," he said, his voice quiet, each word a perfectly polished stone of condemnation. "You used the court system to try and steal his legacy, and you used a child, my child, as your primary weapon. There is no someday for people like you, Ava. There is only now, and now is over." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The finality in his tone was absolute. He turned his back on her, the gesture a complete and total dismissal, and walked out of the room, each step heavy with the weight of a betrayal he was only beginning to process. Now Ava Munro was alone with the one person she had truly sought to conquer Matriarch Hawthorne. All the fight, all the artifice had vanished. She was no longer a rival. She was a bug under a microscope. Matriarch had not moved. She sat in her chair, a queen upon her throne, and simply watched the lesser woman disintegrate. She had endured the sneers, the tabloid headlines, the pitying looks, the agonizing spectacle of her husband's name being dragged through the mud, all for this. Her victory was so absolute, so devastating it felt less like triumph and more like witnessing a biblical smiting. "Please," Ava whimpered, turning her tear-streaked face to the matriarch. "Mrs. Hawthorne. Matriarch." Matriarch rose from her chair, her movement fluid and graceful. She walked not towards Ava, but towards the bell pull near the fireplace. "Thomas," she said into the silence, her voice perfectly even. "Ms. Munro is leaving." She then turned her gaze upon Ava, and for the first time Ava saw past the pearls and the Chanel suits to the core of pure, unyielding steel beneath. "Get out of my house," Matriarch said. The words were quiet, yet they resonated with the force of a command that had never been disobeyed. They were not a request. They were a judgment, a banishment, an erasure. Ava stumbled to her feet, grabbing her purse, her hands shaking so violently she could barely grasp the clasp. She fled a blur of cream-colored silk and shame, nearly colliding with the butler Thomas in the doorway. He stood aside, his face impassive, as she scrambled past him and out into the vast, unforgiving marble hall, her desperate flight a pathetic postscript to her grand performance. The library was finally silent, purged of outsiders. Only the Hawthornes and Benjamin Carter remained adrift in the wreckage of their family's history. Adrian had not returned. Catherine, who had watched the entire exchange with a horrified fascination, finally let out a shuddering breath and began to cry softly. Her tears were a strange cocktail of relief for her family, and a profound shared sorrow for a woman named Isabel she had never known, and for a brother she had just discovered. Matriarch walked over to the grand window, her back to the room, and looked out at the manicured gardens as the sun began its descent, casting long, mournful shadows across the lawn. For 45 years, she had believed she knew Conrad. She knew his charm, his ruthlessness, his appetites, his demons. But this was a foundational myth she never knew existed. A great love. A hidden son. It recontextualized her entire life. Her marriage, their children, the empire they built, had it all been an elaborate second act to a play whose tragic beginning she had never been allowed to witness. The anger she had expected to feel was absent. The searing humiliation of the courtroom felt distant now, almost trivial. It had been an attack on their finances, their name. This letter was an attack on her heart, on her history. Yet paradoxically, it brought a strange and terrible peace. The phantom of Ava Monroe, a vulgar and modern ghost, had been vanquished by a far older, more powerful one. "Benjamin," she said, her voice steady. "This son, Ethan, Conrad said he was a carpenter. Is that true?" Benjamin Carter, looking drained, nodded. "It is. Lives in a small town in Oregon. Builds custom furniture. Married to his high school sweetheart. 2 daughters. He is the opposite of a Hawthorne matriarch, in all the best ways." He paused, remembering his own conversations with Conrad in his final months. When Conrad finally found him and told him everything, his first question wasn't about money. It was about his mother. He wanted to know if she had been happy. That simple detail struck Matriarch more forcefully than anything else. "What does he want with this fortune?" Catherine asked, wiping her eyes. "Conrad said he wants to start a foundation," Benjamin replied, a genuine warmth in his voice for the first time. "In his mother's name. The Isabelle Dubois Foundation, to provide grants and studio space for struggling young artists, immigrant artists specifically." Catherine let out a small, watery laugh, a sound of pure, astonished irony. "My father, the great patron of the arts," she murmured, shaking her head. "He always called my canvases expensive dust collectors." The days that followed were a period of strange, suspended reality. The outside world was held at bay by a firewall of lawyers and public relations experts. The news of the letter's contents did not leak, but its shock waves were immediately felt in the circles that mattered. The prestigious firm of Kirkland & Ellis issued a terse press release announcing they no longer represented Ava Monroe, citing irreconcilable professional differences. Whispers of a quiet investigation for perjury and fraud, launched by the district attorney's office, began to circulate. The official Hawthorne PR machine released a single, masterful statement. Following the recent court proceedings, new and definitive information has come to light regarding the paternity of Leo Monroe. The Hawthorne family considers the matter unequivocally closed. The world was left to speculate, but the message was clear: the mistress had not won. She had been annihilated. Adrian, meanwhile, remained in a self-imposed exile at his downtown penthouse, grappling with a reality far more complex than a simple financial loss. He had a son, a 5-year-old boy conceived in a drunken, meaningless encounter he barely remembered with the woman who had just tried to ruin his entire family. He did what Hawthornes do. In a crisis, he hired the best lawyers. A new paternity test was discreetly arranged, a quiet clinical procedure far from the glare of the media. The results came back within 48 hours, confirming what his father's ghost had already told him. 19 99.999%. He was the father. The dynastic battle for the Hawthorne legacy was over. But Adrian's personal war, the war for his own soul, was just beginning. 2 weeks after the reading of the letter, after a series of cautious, mediated phone calls, Ethan Dubois agreed to fly to New York. He did not arrive by private jet. He flew coach on an Alaska Airlines flight, landing at JFK on a grey Tuesday afternoon. He was not met by a liveried chauffeur with a sign, but by Catherine, who had insisted on being the family's first ambassador. She spotted him easily in the chaos of the arrivals hall. He stood out by not trying to. He was in his early 50s, with a tall, rangy build and Conrad's piercing blue eyes. But they were set in a face that held none of his father's predatory restlessness. His hair was more grey than brown. His face was lined and weathered from years of outdoor work, and his hands, when he took hers, were calloused and strong. He wore simple jeans, a worn flannel shirt, and scuffed work boots, carrying a single battered duffel bag. "Catherine?" he asked, his voice softer and gentler than she had expected. "Ethan." She smiled, feeling a wave of relief and a strange, immediate kinship. "Welcome to the circus." The ride back to the city was quiet, at first the two of them feeling each other out. He looked out the window at the New York skyline with an artist's appreciation, not a conqueror's. "Your father." "Conrad," Ethan said, stumbling over the name. "He visited me. Twice. The second time, he knew he was sick. He seemed sad. He was a professional at being sad when it suited him." Catherine said, a touch of her old cynicism returning. Ethan looked at her. "No," he said gently. "This was different. It was quiet. He just wanted to talk about my mom. He wanted to know what she was like, as a mother." This simple statement disarmed Catherine, cracking through her defenses. She realized this man didn't just represent a secret. He represented a different version of her father, a man she had never known. The formal meeting took place in the grand salon of the mansion. It was achingly, excruciatingly awkward. Ethan stood in the middle of the vast room, his hands shoved in his pockets, looking at the silk wallpaper and priceless art with a polite, detached curiosity. He was not intimidated. He simply did not belong, and he knew it. Matriarch was the first to approach a deliberate act of leadership. She had spent 2 weeks dissecting her own feelings, cycling through anger, grief, and a strange, grudging respect for her dead husband's final masterful play. She looked at Ethan, searching his face for Conrad, and found him in the set of his jaw and the color of his eyes. But everything else, the quiet strength, the lack of pretense, was clearly from the woman named Isabel. "Mr. Dubois," she began, her voice formal. "Ethan, please," he said, offering a small, shy smile that transformed his face. "And you must be matriarch. I'm very sorry for your loss, and I am truly sorry for all of this." He gestured vaguely, a motion that encompassed the room, the scandal, the entire tangled mess of their lives. That simple, genuine apology was a battering ram against her formidable composure. "Thank you, Ethan," she said, her voice softening more than she intended. "Conrad described your mother in his letter. She sounded like a remarkable woman." "She was," he said, a universe of love and old grief in those 2 simple words. Adrian arrived last, entering the room like a man walking into his own sentencing. He had seen a photograph of Ethan, but seeing him in the flesh was different. This was the man who had, without lifting a finger, inherited the personal fortune Adrian had always assumed would one day be partly his. This was the living, breathing proof of his father's deepest secret. Resentment warred with a begrudging curiosity. Ethan met his gaze directly. There was no judgment in his eyes, no hint of triumph. "Adrian," Ethan said, breaking the silence and extending a hand. "It's good to meet you. I hear we might have a nephew in common." The unexpected, gentle humor of the statement, addressing the most painful and complicated part of the situation head-on, lanced the tension in the room. A reluctant, wry smile touched Adrian's lips for the first time in weeks. He shook Ethan's calloused hand, the contrast with his own smooth one stark. "It seems we do," he said, his voice rough. "It's complicated." "I imagine everything in this family is," Ethan replied with a knowing look. That evening, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the family had dinner together, this new, strange, fractured version of a family. Ethan, coaxed by Catherine, spoke about his life in Oregon, his wife, Sarah, his 2 teenage daughters, his passion for the grain of wood and the scent of sawdust. He asked Catherine about her art, not as a hobby, but as a craft. He asked Adrian about the challenges of running a global hotel empire in a changing world. He listened. He did not belong in their world of hostile takeovers and social warfare, and he had no desire to. He wasn't a rival or a threat. He was a revelation. He was the final confounding gift from Conrad Hawthorne, a bridge to a past they never knew, and a chance to redefine what their family's legacy could truly mean. It wasn't just about 5-star hotels and billion-dollar valuations. It was about righting old wrongs, honoring hidden truths, and the quiet, daunting but hopeful task of building something new from the ashes. In the end, Conrad Hawthorne's death was not an ending, but a violent, brilliant beginning. The Mistress Ava Monroe faded into obscurity. A cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties, her name forever tainted by scandal and fraud. The vast fortune she craved became the seed of something beautiful. The Isabelle Dubois Foundation, which under Ethan's guidance and with Catherine's passionate involvement began to foster a new generation of artists. Adrian, humbled and changed, stepped up. He began the slow, painful process of building a relationship with his son Leo, shielding the boy from the sins of his parents. And Matriarch Hawthorne, the matriarch who had weathered the ultimate betrayal, found a strange peace. She had lost a husband, but regained a sense of her own formidable strength. The Hawthorne family was no longer the perfect dynasty it had pretended to be. It was broken, real, and finally on a path toward healing. What do you think? Was this justice, or just the final elaborate power play of a dying billionaire? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you love unforgettable stories of family secrets, dramatic twists and justice served cold, make sure to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good drama, and subscribe to our channel for more true-life sagas you won't want to miss. Click that notification bell so you never miss an update.